Imagine opening your eyes 2,000 years ago, stepping into the world of the 1st century AD. It is not the beep of a smartphone alarm or the honk of a school bus that wakes you up. Instead, it is the clatter of wooden chariot wheels on cobblestone, the shouts of early morning bakers, and the heavy, smoky scent of oil lamps burning in the courtyard. History books usually tell us about conquering emperors, colossal battles, and fierce gladiators. But living in the shadows of those towering stone columns were millions of children. Children who ran through the streets, fought with wooden swords, and were afraid of the dark. What did it actually mean to be a child in that era? Today, the birth of a baby begins with celebrations, but 2,000 years ago, birth was quite literally a battle for survival. Infant mortality rates were so devastatingly high that nearly half of all children born would not live to see their 10th birthday. Because of this, parents were terrified of growing attached too quickly, often refusing to even name their babies for the first few days. But simply taking a breath was not always enough. A newborn baby's fate rested entirely in the hands of the oldest male of the household. When a baby was born, it was placed on the floor at the father's feet. If the father leaned down and picked the child up, it meant the child would be raised. But if he turned his back and walked away, that child was abandoned in city dumps or the forest. But the tragedy did not always end with abandonment. Scavengers and slave traders would frequently patrol these city dumps at night, picking up the discarded infants. They would feed them just enough to keep them alive, raising them for a single dark purpose: to become lifelong slaves, heavy laborers, or entertainment in the future gladiator arenas. Let us say your father picked you up. You survived. They placed a golden amulet on your chest to protect you from evil spirits. But being lifted from your father's feet and clinging to life was only the prologue in this dark era. Surviving the first week was actually the easy part. The true horror would reveal itself once these children learned to walk and understand the world around them. Today, children hold glowing tablets or battery-operated toys in their hands. 2,000 years ago, the materials dictated the imagination. They had mud, wood, bone, and stone. Archaeological excavations show us something fascinating. In ancient Greece and Rome, little girls played with terracotta dolls that had moving arms and legs, just like the dolls of today. Boys pulled wooden toy horses through the alleys and fought with wooden swords. Games played with sheep bones, hide and seek, and blind man's bluff echoed through the streets. But these joyful shouts were actually a grand illusion. They were a ruthless preparation. While children played with wooden swords or dressed their clay dolls, they were unknowingly running a simulation of the bloody and heavy future waiting for them. Very soon, those wooden swords would be replaced by real iron, and those dolls by a deadly reality. So, when exactly did the era of play end, and what happened to children at that breaking point? The answer was turning 7 years old. 7 was the ultimate turning point for a child 2,000 years ago. At this age, games were suddenly cut short, and the harsh realities of life began. If you were a child of a wealthy family, a brutal education awaited you. Schools were not bright buildings, but cramped spaces behind shops. Because paper was expensive, they wrote on wax-coated wooden tablets using sharp bone pens. The prevailing rule was simple: a child who does not learns by being beaten. A child who made a mistake instantly met the teacher's cane. But if you were a poor child or a slave, you would never even see those wax tablets. From the age of 7, your school was the sun-scorched field, the hot blacksmith forge, or the stone quarry. Small children were specifically used to crawl into the narrow, oxygen-deprived tunnels of mines. For young girls in poorer families, their fate was sealed within the walls of the home. From dawn until dusk, they spun wool, washed heavy garments, and wove fabric until their fingers bled. There was no room for error, and a single ruined thread could mean facing the harsh wrath of a desperate household. Yet, whether you were a slave carrying rocks on your shoulders in a mine, or a noble child memorizing poetry in a room decorated with gold, there was an invisible serial killer waiting by everyone's bedside every single night. Wealth or power could not stop this killer, and the doctors of the ancient world used methods to fight this invisible demon that would make our blood run cold today. In a world without modern medicine and vaccines, a fever was not just an illness. It was usually a death sentence. Chickenpox, measles, dysentery, and malaria were the greatest nightmares of children 2,000 years ago. When a child fell ill, doctors could do very little. Desperation drove people to supernatural forces. Mothers were made to sacrifice animals at temples, and garlic was hung under beds to chase away demons. Even respected scientists of the time suggested cures like eating crushed owl brains or rubbing frog blood on the skin to cure childhood diseases. Children were fighting to survive not just viruses, but also these toxic medical rituals. Let us say you survived that deadly birth. You were not crushed in the dark mines, and you survived those bizarre diseases treated with frog blood. You are finally safe and ready to build your own life, right? No, because 2,000 years ago, childhood was not a sweet, slowly fading youth like we know today. That phase of self-discovery we call being a teenager was completely uninvented. When the end approached, childhood was ripped away in a single night through a brutal and irreversible ritual. For girls, this line was marriage. A girl between the ages of 12 and 14 was suddenly considered a woman. The night before her wedding, she would perform a heartbreaking ritual. She would take her beloved terracotta dolls and her childhood clothes and dedicate them to the gods on an altar. This ritual was the official declaration of saying, "I am no longer a child." The very next day, she would marry a man chosen by her father, who was perhaps 20 years older than her, and very soon after, she would enter that deadly battlefield of childbirth as a mother herself. For boys, the boundary was usually between 14 and 16. They would go to the city square with their families, take off their childhood clothes, and put on the white toga worn by adult men. They took the protective amulet from their necks and offered it to the household gods. From that moment on, they were no longer protected by magic, but by their own swords. They could instantly join the legions and go to war, or be put on trial in the courts. There was no time to process this change. They simply had to bury their fears and act like men. To be a child 2,000 years ago was a short, dangerous, and intense survival game that forced you to grow up instantly. Yet, tiny footprints found in ancient excavations, broken wooden toys buried in the dirt, and agonizing farewells carved into tombstones whisper a very fundamental truth to us. No matter how ruthless the conditions were, a child's smile, their desire to play, and a mother's fierce love for her child have not changed in thousands of years. The little bone dice they left behind still speak to us today, reminding us of how cruel and at the same time how incredibly precious time has always been.